The night Orla Maddigan refused to sedate Conrad Voss, she didn't know his last name. She didn't know who his father was, or what his father owned, or how many men his father could make disappear between one phone call and the next. She only knew the number on his wristband, the chart in her hands, and the fact that what the attending physician had just ordered was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not a judgment call kind of wrong. Wrong in the way that kills people. Orla had been a nurse at St. Clement's for 3 years, long enough to know which doctors listened and which ones bristled when a nurse pushed back. Dr. Felton was the second kind. He was also the kind who wrote orders from the hallway while already walking toward the elevator, which was exactly what he'd done 20 minutes ago. She'd flagged him twice. The first time he'd said, "It's fine, Maddigan." The second time, he hadn't even slowed down. The patient in room 14 was 17 years old, post-op from an emergency appendectomy, and had already been administered a sedative 3 hours prior. The new order would double what was already in his bloodstream. His last vitals had shown a dip in his oxygen saturation that no one else seemed concerned about. But Orla had been watching the monitors long enough to know what that kind of dip meant at 2 in the morning. She stood in the hallway outside room 14 for exactly 4 seconds. Then she walked to the nurse's station, pulled up the file, and documented her concern. Then she walked back to room 14 and did not administer the medication. It was the longest night of her career, and she didn't know it yet. The boy woke up at 6:43 in the morning, groggy and irritable, and asked for his phone. Orla checked his oxygen levels, normal, and noted the time in the chart. She refilled his water pitcher. She smiled at him, even though he didn't smile back. By 8, 2 men in dark suits were standing at the nurse's station. Orla noticed them the way you notice something out of place, a texture that doesn't belong in the room. They weren't doctors. They weren't family. They wore the kind of shoes that cost more than her monthly rent. And they stood very still in the way that people stand still when they are used to rooms rearranging themselves around their presence. The charge nursed. Janet was on the phone and waving at them absently. One of the men in suits turned and looked directly at Orla. "Mrs. Maddigan," he said. "Not a question." She stopped walking. "Yes." "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you." Orla looked from one man to the other. "I have 4 patients. We can wait," the man said. "And then after a beat, we're good at that." She thought about calling security. She thought about what Janet would say. She thought about the fact that the boy in room 14 had a last name she hadn't looked up until 40 minutes ago, when the morning shift supervisor had come to find her with a look on her face that Orla had never seen before, not exactly fear. Something closer to the held breath moment before a storm. Voss, as in Meridian Voss. As in the man who had, according to 3 different sources in the past hour, rebuilt 40% of the city's waterfront, owned a private security firm with contracts in 6 states, and had not in recent memory been told no by anyone with a functioning survival instinct. Orla looked at the man in the dark suit. "Let me get someone to cover my patients," she said. The drive was 22 minutes through morning traffic, a black SUV with windows, tinted dark enough that the city outside looked like something remembered, rather than something real. Neither of the men spoke. Orla sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and she thought about the chart. She thought about the oxygen levels. She thought about the look on Janet's face. She was not going to apologize. She had decided that before she got in the car, the building they brought her to didn't announce itself. No signage, no glittering lobby, just a converted industrial building in the warehouse district, all dark brick and steel-framed windows, the kind of architecture that cost a great deal of money to look as though it cost nothing. A man held the door. Another man pressed a button on an elevator. Nobody spoke to her as though she were a threat, but nobody spoke to her as though she were a guest either. She was something else. A variable. The elevator opened into a space that stopped her mid-step, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river, morning light cutting across exposed concrete floors, a long oak table in the center of the room with papers on it, a coffee press, 2 chairs, The whole thing had the feeling of a place where real decisions happened. Not the sanitized board meeting kind of decision, but the kind that didn't get written down. There was a man standing at the windows. He was taller than she'd expected from the photographs she'd managed to pull up on her phone during the drive. Broader, too, with the kind of physical stillness that didn't come from relaxation, but from absolute control. He was in his early 50s, maybe, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that would have been called handsome in a harder decade. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, and he was looking out at the river as though he hadn't heard the elevator. He had heard the elevator. "Mrs. Maddigan," he said without turning. "Mr. Voss." He turned then. His eyes were a very pale grey, the kind that made people feel assessed rather than seen. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the particular concentration of a man who had made a career of reading rooms. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He poured coffee into one of the cups on the table and pushed it toward her without asking whether she wanted any. She noticed absently that it was the good kind, not the institutional kind, not the break room kind, the kind that smells like it was ground this morning. He didn't sit. He remained standing at the window, one hand in his pocket, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the river. "My son's oxygen saturation dropped overnight," he said. "Briefly," Orla said. "It's stabilized, because you didn't administer the medication." "Yes, the medication a licensed physician ordered, a physician who hadn't reviewed the full chart and wasn't aware of the combination risk." She kept her voice even. "I documented everything. If Dr. Felton wants to dispute my clinical judgment, the record is clear." Meridian Voss was quiet for a moment. Outside, a barge moved slowly along the river. He watched it. "Dr. Felton has been practicing for 23 years, he said. "I know. He has privileges at 4 hospitals in this city. I know that too. And you still didn't follow his order." Orla looked at him steadily. "Your son was 17 years old, and his saturation was dropping. The order as written would have made it worse. I wasn't willing to do that." The silence stretched. She was very aware of her own pulse. Then Meridian Voss said, "Conrad told me a nurse argued with his doctor last night. He said you were annoying about it." A pause. "He also said you checked on him 4 times before you went off shift." She hadn't realized the boy had been awake for any of those checks. "He pretended to be asleep," she said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in the pale grey eyes. It was brief, and it was gone quickly, but she caught it. Something that was not quite a smile, but was the shadow of one. "He does that," Voss said. "He's been doing that since he was 4 years old." He finally pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He poured his own coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her as though he'd made some kind of decision. "I want to understand something," he said. "You knew who his father was by the time you made the call. I didn't. Not when I made the call. When did you find out?" "This morning." "And what did you think?" Orla considered the question honestly. "I thought I'd made the right call and I wasn't going to apologize for it, regardless of who his father was." Voss looked at her for a long time. "No one's asked you to apologize," he said. "Your men picked me up from the hospital before I finished my shift," she said. It felt implied. That silence again. Then, and she would remember this later, in the way you remember the moment a storm breaks, he laughed. Not loudly, not for a long time, but it was real. It reached his eyes in a way that made him look for just a moment like someone she might have known in a different life. "Fair point," he said. He set down his cup. He looked out the window again, and when he looked back, the amusement was still there, but something else had settled under it. Something older. "His mother died when he was 11, Voss said. "After that, I made a lot of decisions I thought were protecting him. Turns out I was just." He stopped. Started again. "He's been in and out of trouble for 2 years. Not serious trouble. The kind of trouble that doesn't get serious because people look the other way when they see his last name." He said this without pride, with something closer to exhaustion. "Last month, he took his friend's car without permission and drove it into a retaining wall, going 40 miles over the limit. The officer on scene filed a report and then lost it." Orla said nothing. I didn't ask him to lose it, Voss said. I want to be clear about that. People just... He made a slight gesture with one hand, the kind that meant you understand. The problem is Conrad knows it happens. He's been watching it happen for 2 years, and he's learned things from it that I didn't want him to learn. She thought about the boy in room 14. The irritable request for his phone, the way he'd lain there pretending to be asleep while she checked his vitals. What did he learn, she asked, even though she already knew. That there's no consequence, Voss said. That the name is a wall nobody climbs. That he can be as reckless as he wants and the city will just absorb it. He looked at his hands. Last night was the first time in 2 years someone looked at a situation involving my son and made the correct call without first looking up who I am. Orla held very still. You didn't know his name, Voss continued. You didn't look at him and see a liability. You saw a 17-year-old kid with a chart that didn't add up, and you made the call that any nurse worth a damn should make. He looked at her directly. I'm not here to threaten you, Miss Maddigan. I want you to understand that clearly. Then why am I here? Because I wanted to meet the person who did it. He paused. And because I want to ask you something. She waited. Conrad has a long road of recovery ahead. Several follow-up appointments, therapy consultations, the works. He leaned back slightly. I'd like to request that you be one of them, his primary nurse for post-op care. Orla blinked. Of all the things she had imagined this conversation becoming, she had not imagined this. That's a staffing decision, she said. I don't have authority over my own assignments. I'm aware I'm asking if you'd be willing if you were asked. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the boy who pretended to be asleep. She thought about what Meridian Voss had just told her, about 2 years of a city quietly rearranging itself around his son's mistakes, about what that kind of growing up does to a person. Yes, she said. If it was the right fit clinically, I'd be willing. Voss nodded once. The subject apparently was settled. He stood, and she stood too, and for a moment they were just 2 people standing on either side of a table in a room full of morning light, and the distance between them felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Not smaller exactly, just differently shaped. I'll have someone drive you back, he said. I have a shift in 4 hours, she said. I'll need to sleep first. Of course, he paused. He seemed for a moment uncertain, which was strange, because she suspected Meridian Voss was almost never uncertain. He said, for what you did last night. Orla picked up her jacket from the chair. He would have been fine, she said. Probably, Voss repeated. But probably isn't good enough for a 17-year-old kid at 2 in the morning. He looked at her. No, he said, it isn't. The following 3 weeks were not what she expected. Conrad Voss, it turned out, was exactly as irritating as she'd anticipated and considerably more complicated than she'd assumed. He was 17 going on 45 in all the wrong ways, the way of someone who had watched the world accommodate itself to him for so long that he'd stopped believing it could do anything else. He argued about his medication schedule. He argued about the visiting hours. He argued once about the temperature of the water she brought him, which was a new low even by the standards she was developing for him. But he also asked her, on the 3rd visit, what she'd studied in school. And on the 5th visit, when she mentioned she'd started nursing after almost 3 years in a pre-med program that she'd eventually left because of the debt load, he was quiet for a long time and then said, "That's a weird thing to just decide." "Most things are," she said. "Did you thought about it?" "Some days." He looked at the ceiling. "I don't know what I want to do," he said. It came out like a confession, like something he'd been carrying for a while and set down by accident. "Everyone assumes I'll just take over whatever my dad has, but I've never actually been asked." Orla made a note in his chart. "Have you told him that?" Conrad said nothing. "You should probably tell him that," she said. She didn't know at the time that Meridian Voss was in the hallway. She found out later, not from him, but from the way Conrad seemed different at the next appointment. Not softer, exactly. Just less braced. like something had shifted in the architecture of whatever relationship existed between the two of them, and he hadn't decided yet how to stand in the new space. She saw Voss himself only twice during those 3 weeks. Once, briefly, in the hallway outside the consultation room. He nodded at her, and she nodded back, and neither of them said anything, but she thought about it afterward more than was strictly professional. The second time was at the end of Conrad's final post-op consultation, when Voss was waiting in the corridor, and they ended up walking toward the elevator at the same time. "He's doing well," she said. "I know, they told me." He glanced at her. "He told me too. That's newer." "That's good, yes." He pressed the elevator button. "He said you gave him a hard time about the water temperature." She felt her mouth want to do something. She controlled it. "He complained? He mentioned it." A pause. "I think he meant it as a compliment." The elevator came. They both paused at the doors, that moment where two people are going in the same direction and realize it simultaneously. He gestured for her to go first. "I've been wanting to ask you something," he said, as the doors closed. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked. Direct, no preamble, no hedging. The same way he'd poured the coffee 3 weeks ago, as though asking permission for things was a language he'd learned but never become fluent in. Not a professional thing, not in any capacity related to Conrad or St. Clement's. He paused. Just dinner. Orla looked at the elevator doors. They reflected back a version of herself she wasn't entirely sure she recognized, tired, a little undone around the edges, standing next to a man who moved through the world like a force of weather. "You own half the waterfront," she said. "About a third," he said. "I live in an apartment where the radiator makes a sound like someone tapping Morse code at 3 in the morning. That sounds disruptive." "It is," she said. "I'm used to it." She paused. "We are very different people." "We are," he said. And then, with a quiet certainty, "I'm asking anyway." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Orla stepped out into the lobby and stood for a moment in the afternoon light coming through the glass, and she thought about the oxygen monitor at 2 in the morning. She thought about the chart in her hands and the 4 seconds she'd stood in the hallway. She thought about the fact that the correct call was not always the easy call, and that the difference between them was the only thing that ever seemed to matter. She turned around. "Thursday," she said. "I'm off at 6. Voss looked at her. The pale grey eyes, the silver at his temples, the shadow of that same not-quite smile she'd caught in the first minute she'd ever spent in the same room with him. "I'll pick you up at 7, he said. "Give you time to change." "I don't need time to change," she said. He considered this. 7, then. She walked out of the hospital into the afternoon, and the city was doing what cities do. Moving, breathing, indifferent. And somewhere behind her Meridian Voss was presumably doing the same, moving back into the particular gravity of his own life, his deals and his waterfront, and his one difficult son who was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to reconsider the shape of himself. Orla walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off. She thought about Thursday. She thought about Conrad's chart and what she'd written in it, and what she'd staked on it, and how that single decision had led, in the indirect, improbable way that real life leads anywhere, to standing in an elevator and saying yes to something that made no logical sense and felt, against all reasonable expectation, like the right call. She'd learned 3 years ago in a hallway outside room 14 on a different shift at a different hospital that the right call and the easy call were almost never the same thing. She had also learned slowly, incompletely, through the particular education of caring for people at their most vulnerable, that the right call was almost always worth making anyway. She started the engine. Outside, the city moved and breathed. The river caught the afternoon light and threw it back at the sky. And somewhere on the waterfront, cranes moved in their slow mechanical choreography over everything Meridian Voss had built. And Orla Maddigan drove home through traffic with the radiator waiting, and Thursday a week away, and something in her chest that felt very much like the moment before a first breath.